Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this virtual professional development offering hosted by myself. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. Today, we are talking about hands-on history and how to use primary sources in your remote or distance learning classroom. The good news about today's session are these are also tips and tricks and questions that can and should be asked of students when they are in your classroom in person dealing with primary sources. So right before hitting record, I asked all the participants to pull up some primary sources, a minimum of one, but best case scenario, at least 2 or 3, because as we get going later on in the session, I will be asking questions that will be involving multiple sources all at one time. So what is this based on? What I'm looking at, this is disciplinary literacy. We're talking about disciplinary literacy and social studies. And Timothy Shanahan, one of the leaders in disciplinary literacy research out of the University of Illinois, Chicago, he says if you're talking about disciplinary literacy and history, there's a couple things that students need to be able to do. One is site-specific evidence to support the analysis. And what this focuses on, this is sourcing. Anytime a kid's dealing with a primary source, they need to know the name, date, and origin of that piece. That research has also been corroborated by research done by Sam Weinberg out of Stanford that talks about how historians deal with sources. And that's one of the things that we have to understand is the importance of when, where, and who in terms of a source. We have to be able to, according to Timothy Shanahan, analyze a series of events for cause and effect. We need to be able to identify a point of view, and I apologize for the abbreviations, a POV, a point of view, and corroborate it with other POVs, point of views. So when I was in the classroom, one of the first things I would talk about with kids when we look at primary sources is the understanding that everybody's biased, and that's okay. Everybody comes from a point of view, and we just need to understand what that point of view is. The Queen of England is going to have a different point of view than a peasant in England. And their ideas and their experiences are going to be shaped by who they are in that point of view. And it doesn't necessarily mean either one of them's right or wrong or better or worse, but having to understand that point of view to help make that reasoned judgment. The Queen of England says everything is great. The peasant says everything is awful. They might not necessarily be lying, but they're going to be conflicting ideas. And so having kids understand why the queen would say that or why the peasant would say that. So again, that goes back to that sourcing component of understanding where they're coming from. Students need to be able to interpret meanings of keywords and phrases. And again, this is one of the reasons why I like to stress an image component of it. That way you're not oftentimes getting caught up on the words. Social studies people are pretty good about making things up that don't make sense. For example, the Gilded Age is not an era in which everybody was actually gilded. And that could throw students for a loop. So you have to be careful about understanding what those things might mean. And then make sure you're integrating multiple viewpoints and diverse sources to develop the understanding, right? It's not just a male perspective or not just a president perspective or not just a northern perspective or a white perspective or a rich perspective, whatever it is. Make sure that you're bringing such a wide variety to the table, because then where a lot of that real learning happens is the discrepancies. Again, why is the Queen of England saying something different than a peasant? And what we're actually working to train students to be are criticalists. It's the idea that they don't automatically agree with everything and they don't automatically throw something out, but they are critical of all sides until properly evaluated, and then they take a stance on which one is deemed to be superior. I like to quote Cynthia Shanahan on this, where she talks about that we need to be healthy, have a healthy level of skepticism when it comes to reading primary sources. We can't just straight out and be skeptics with everything, but there is the idea of some healthy level of skepticism. So when students are given a stance, given these pieces to look at, what you need to make sure that they're doing is they need to be active in the process. They need to be involved. They need to be handling the primary sources. They need to be asking the questions, taking a stance on their own. There should not be a top-down level approach for us giving them the answers. They need to be allowed to construct their own independent interpretation of events different from others. This is where I go back to Bruce Lesh in his book. The book's title is Why Won't You Just Tell Us the Answer? And that idea is there isn't necessarily an answer. If we talk about what is the capital of Maine, there would be an answer. But if we were to talk about, like, one of my favorite questions is, where should the capital of Maine be today? If we were to move it today, you have to have that willingness for students to come up with any sort of answer and be okay with anything they support. That even if a majority of the classroom settles on one area, if one or two students have a different view, that shouldn't be grounds for being wrong or incorrect, as long as they can support that. Students need to be aware of the strategies that can be used to effectively weigh the evidence. And those are some of the things that we're going to talk about today, some of those questioning pieces. And then this would be part of the instruction that, for me, I would talk about, like, your year-round learning with students should be an improvement of these type of strategies, regardless of, like, if you're teaching a world history class, it shouldn't matter if it's the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, they should still be working on these type of strategies. But then that last part we kind of alluded to, you have to base your claim on evidence. So students need to be able to point back to these primary sources. And again, they should be able to develop their own understanding and construct their own interpretation, but it still has to be based on evidence. One of the things I tell teachers all the time in working with students is point at it. If they're dealing with a primary source or any sort of information and they're making an argument, they need to be able to point at the picture or the text to show exactly where it's coming from. That's our evidence-based claims. Using graphic organizers is a great piece in here. I'm gonna give you kind of a checklist of questions, but you're looking through, give students guidance with this type of work. You don't just hand them the documents and let them go. It can be done in peer groups, a gradual release of responsibility. If your students aren't doing a lot of work with primary sources now, you should do it and model it and show it out loud. Doug Buell says that the number one thing that we can share with our students is the ability for them to understand our thinking. So if you put a picture up on the board, just say out loud, what are the questions you are asking? How are you attacking it, right? Show it, model it, let them practice it in small groups, and then before they get down to doing it on their own. Give them regular opportunities to engage in disciplinary thinking. This should not be a one-off piece. For me, your primary sources and review of secondary sources as well should be an ongoing component of every, maybe not daily units or lesson that you're doing, but every component of that course, whatever the topic area, should be involved in this in some way to let them engage in that part. Textbooks are okay. I get that question, well, what do you think about textbooks? Textbooks are not inherently bad. One of the things we talk about is Keith Barton at Indiana University. His research says that students believe textbooks to be the most reliable source of information. But we know as historians, I always say, like, no historian ever cites a textbook, right? They don't, when they're writing their critical reviews, they don't say, well, according to this textbook, right? Because textbooks don't have footnotes. And so again, that doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong, but understanding what is the role of a textbook and helping your students understand that a textbook is just part of an information piece. Jeffrey Noakes at BYU encourages teachers to have your students write a textbook page. Have them look at a page in a textbook and say, okay, we're talking about the Mongolian Empire. Okay, what would your one page in the textbook look like? Have them considering the appropriate images, charts, graphs, maps, wording, stuff like that. Because then they'll come to understand how when you get that little blank template, you really have to keep things at kind of that vanilla level that we tend to see with social studies textbooks, which makes it difficult to get into a lot of the primary source depth. And then again, that last piece kind of hit on this earlier, is that students should be assessed in a way that allows them to make those defensible interpretations, right? I've worked with a lot of teachers who are like, yes, this is great, I totally agree, this is wonderful, but my end of year test is a multiple choice. Right? And there are actually ways, I've done sessions where you can do multiple choice tests that are really rigorous and develop historical thinking skills, but that's not usually what we think. So give your kids the opportunity to write, to engage in a document-based question, or to engage in some of the work that we're going to do today with some of the examples that I give you. Okay, So if you're going to assess the students on that, what should you be looking for? They should be thinking deeply about whatever central question you pose to them. I love using inquiry as my grounding of all my lessons. And again, the idea is not a right one, but it's something to get them thinking. They should be looking at spending time evaluating sources. A student can be assessed on just their ability to group sources. That can be a check-in with students. And again, it doesn't have to be a right answer. Give students eight images from the Civil War and ask them to group them into 2 or 3 groups and explain their grouping. I've done this with teachers, right? There isn't a right grouping. Some people say, well, this is more about people, this is more about land. Some would say, well, this is more about death, this is more about guns, or whatever it is. But you're just, again, assessing their ability to make those connections across multiple pieces. We'll talk about sourcing, corroboration, and contextualization to weigh the evidence. You can do this with one piece, you can do it with multiple pieces, but having kids look at those type of questions. We've talked about defending interpretations by using their evidence. One of the hardest things for kids and adults alike is assess them on their ability to have their mind changed when presented with new evidence. Give students limited information and ask them to draw a conclusion. And then give them the rest. What's the old Paul Harvey, the rest of the story? Give them the rest of the story. And are students willing to be flexible enough to change their thinking as new evidence comes out? Because that's one of those things you're going to want to address. If students are always making their mind up with the first bit of information that they make, that's something that we would need to be aware of. Appropriately discount unreliable information. Sneak bad stuff in there and see if students catch it. See if students question why this piece was included. You know, Mr. Schmidt, we got this, that, and the other thing, but this doesn't make sense, right? They should be able to find those pieces and sift them out. And then again, there's a writing piece to it. How are they going to tell you what they're thinking? If they're younger, it can be oral, it can be just a spoken piece. But as they get older, there's definitely a disciplinary writing, blending narration, description, and argumentation. So what you're about to see here in our quick little lightning round, I love using the Stanford History Education Group, the SHEG thinking parts. Their research says that a historian does 4 different things. They source information, they contextualize it, they corroborate it, and they do a close reading of the information. And you see in this chart, they've got it broken down. What are questions that you can ask that meet those things? You have learning targets that you could put up on your board. Students should be able to. And then you have writing prompts that students can write to as well to get their thinking exposed if you want to assess them based on their writing. And this is a very easy chart to find online if you look up SHEG, Historical Thinking Chart, and you see in the bottom right-hand corner is their website for that. Okay. So at this time, I asked everybody to have at least one primary source, preferably an image, but it doesn't have to be, one primary source open and ready to go. I'm going to give you just a quick second to make sure you have one of those up. If you are good to go, can you use the little thumbs up button on the bottom of your screen? Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Lex. Or if you've got your video open, go ahead and give me a thumbs up just so I know where we're at. And again, I'm going to have you engage in this work. These are things I would have your kids do right now. If you're having to send home paper packets, send them a couple pictures or images with a series of questions. If you're wanting to go a no-tech, low-tech piece, you could have them look for pictures around their house, of their parents, of their family, anything that comes on TV, anything that would come in a newspaper or magazine, anything like that. These questions can really be asked of just about anything in our world around us. And then I will stress, when you have the kids back in front of you, this should be a critical part of their social studies learning experience just about all the time. All right, so question number 1, feel free to drop them in the chat box if you want to kind of get a series of stuff. Now, I understand everybody's working with their own unique primary document, but I'm still going to ask the same questions, and I just want to make sure we're engaged. So my first question for you, and at the top I'm noticing that this is a sourcing piece, is who created the document?
Hey, Get down here. Get down here, Bo.
Gina has something. Now, Gina, did the National Archives create it, or did the National Archives have it? And this is one of those things kids will get caught up along all the time. And teachers, I have a set of postcards from the Osher Map Library. That's a series of historical pieces. And a lot of times people will source it as the Osher Map Library. The Osher Map Library may have it. They may have made the postcard, but the image was still an 1800s Portland map or image. So Gina says the founding fathers, technically, is there a specific one? Or are you looking at the Constitution possibly? Donna says John Gast. We've got the Portland Press Herald. We've got the Portland Evening Express. Gina says she's looking at the Declaration of Independence. Mine is unknown, I don't know. Ellsworthmaine.gov, Thomas Nast and Harper's Weekly. Okay, so we've established we now know who made it. That's an important piece. And in some of Sam Weinberg's research, one of the questions are they were reading a piece and then teachers and students were asked to draw conclusions from it. And then the last piece that was revealed was that it was part of a KKK recruitment flyer from 1870. And does that make a difference? It absolutely makes a difference. And so having to make that understanding of who wrote it is very important. So question number 2, I see Shauna put in there that hers was already 1883, but what year was the document created? We need a year in order to put something into context. We've got 1872, 1968, 1920, 1966, 1918. And one of those Stanford skills, again, is contextualization. When you're thinking about why somebody might be saying something a certain way, you do have to know the era in which they were saying it. And not to get down to too many rabbit holes of history, right? But a lot of views and things that would be written are going to be different if they're written in 1776, 1861, 1965, and 2020, right? Those different things change and evolve and work through. And so to understand where that person's coming from, you need to know, first of all, when it was written. We've got all the way back to 500-ish BC. We've got an AD 79, got a wide variety. So my next question for you then, where was the document created? This is usually one of the harder things to find out because it's not always tracked. This might have to be an independent research piece. For example, somebody earlier had a Thomas Nast part. You might have to go find like where was Thomas Nast in a given year? Or is he American, or is he British, or is he German, right, to help students. But that could be that engaging component of a piece if they have access to that type of research. So we've got near Bong Sang, Vietnam. We've got the Lincoln Memorial in DC. We've got Pompeii. We've got Philadelphia. Abigail says hers was published in Washington, DC. We've got New York City, Southwest. The book it was published was in Portland. The photograph was taken in Richmond. So we've got, and now some of them, right, I know that one of them is the Declaration of Independence, but even at this point, if we start to pull out, if you tell me who wrote it, when, and where, I'm already starting to get some pieces of thinking around these individual parts. Some of them I might even be able to have guessed, like the Constitution when she said the founding fathers, that type of stuff. Does the document have a title? This is one of the things we oftentimes overlook, especially when it comes to maps. So if your document does have a title, do you know what it is? So I saw some people are saying yes, some people are saying no. So by the time that you're done with kind of this series of questions, you should be able to, before you even really get into the document, be able to answer who wrote it, when, where, and what was it called? That's your sourcing information. If you're going to talk about this document at all, right? If we're going to talk about that evidence-based claim, you would have to be able to say, well, this was Thomas Nast, Richmond, 1863, called Wabanaki Canoes at the Main Centennial. And I know I just jammed a bunch together, but now we know what we're talking about, right? So now if a student's referencing something, I know exactly what they're talking about. So we've got its source. Now it's time to do a close read. What does it mean to look in social studies? And so some of these different ways I approach this is, I know in ELA and kind of the Common Core stuff, a close read has certain components. For me in social studies, what I like to say is Stanford will often say what's not being said when you're doing a close read. So it's beyond just what the words are actually there. It's that next level interpretation of it. So one of the questions I like to see is just this first reaction. What is something that you see that you think everybody sees? And if you do this in a group of kids, you'll get, I don't want to say guaranteed, but you're probably not going to get every single kid seeing the number one thing at the same time. And it leads to really fascinating discussions. Why Cindy says, keeps track of the time that was left on his short time helmet. Sonia says the mask. Leslie says Dr. M.L. King. What about somebody who doesn't see that immediately? And I've seen it play out. People like, oh, well, I think everybody sees blank. And they're like, oh, you know, at least one person, well, I didn't even notice that, right? So it leads to a discussion. Why? Why did that stand out for you, Leslie or Sonia or Gina? What captured your attention, Abigail or Cindy or Craig? Why were you seeing different things, right? Especially with images. I think that's such a powerful piece because we see the entire image in a snapshot, but we can't take it all in. If you do it with reading or with written components, most people are going to start at the top, right? There's that logical progression, but you don't see that in images, artifacts, paintings, etc. So then the opposite is, what do you see that you don't think anyone else sees, right? So now we're starting to go, we had our initial first gut reaction to something. Now we're starting to scale it back, just go a little deeper now. Here's something that initially hit me, but here's now something that I've noticed that I don't think stands out. What is something that you see that you don't think anyone else sees? And again, this could be, you know, right now in this environment, I would just have the student say, I see this, and then explain why. What about that do you think would not catch other people's attention? Because it caught your attention. At some point you saw it, but you still believe that others might not see it, right? So then just process that thinking. One of the quotes that I use in trainings all the time is, when you ask a student a question, are you looking for the right answer or good thinking? So in this piece, there is no right answer. I could do this with 100 different documents with 100 different kids, or 100 different kids with one document, and there still is not a right answer. What I want to know is, what are the kids' reasoning for why they think others wouldn't see it? That's going to give me the snapshot into their mind. What clarifying question would you want to ask the person who created it? So what's still unclear, right? So now we're getting into that close read even more. I'm looking at something and I'm not quite sure, or I'm reading something and I'm not quite sure. I want to know what a student is not understanding or wants clarification about. And again, then I would ask why. Why this? What don't you understand about this? Tell me more about that piece. Why do you want clarification about, and this might not be Craig's answer here, but why do you want more questions? What does Leslie say? What feeling were you hoping to convey in this image? Right? So why are you saying, why is that question bubbling up for you? Because there's got to be probably something in the image, right? Shauna said, where are the ice houses in the picture? And why didn't you take the picture in the winter? Good question. So let's look at, whoopsie. If you have visuals, And this is some of my work that I've done with the Kennedy Center for the Arts, if you're looking at especially people in images. So this is image specific. How does this picture make you feel? There's an emotional component to an image. Could you do it with a writing prompt? Absolutely. But the idea with the image part, you'll see you were saying kind of some of these other questions, it really goes down onto that, like the emotional response of that first hit of that image. So how does this picture make you feel? It's probably tied to facial expressions. So what facial expressions do you see? Right, that's how human psychology works. When you watch a movie with people who are crying, that's when we cry. When you watch a movie with people who are laughing, that's when we laugh. So when you see an image, something's going to strike you, and oftentimes it's facial image, facial expressions. So then dig deeper on that. They have that initial first feeling. Why? Do the facial expressions match that? Where are the people looking? This is one of those tips and tricks of artists. If there's an image, if there's a person in an image and they're not looking at you, you will follow their eyes, their gaze. You will look to see what they're looking at. So if an artist wants you to look at a certain place in a painting, they will oftentimes have somebody in the painting looking in that direction. So it's a cue. Why? Where are they looking? What's there? Is that important? Photography might be a little bit different unless it's a staged photography piece, right? I'm thinking about senior pictures and stuff where people are posed, right? There's certain ways you have them look down, you have them look up or over, right? The mood, again, is associated with the facial expression and where they're looking. Are there people making gestures? Because we oftentimes draw a lot of inferences from an image, but we really don't know. They're not moving. But based on the gesture, we can infer that they are walking, that they are jumping, that they're excited, that they're laughing, that they're crying. So we look for that snapshot moment, but it's a gesture to try to figure out what that person is doing. And the reason you have to slow down when it comes to visual imaging, we assume we see it all immediately and we process it immediately, but oftentimes we're just making inferences based on the information. We assume that that person is walking, but we're not sure. But the body language says that's what it's supposed to be. And that could absolutely be correct, but oftentimes we just want students to slow down, take a breath, and just look. What are they wearing? And I see people talking about hats, taking off their hats. What are they wearing? And does that make a difference? So Cindy said military fatigues. I'm guessing that sets a different tone than a suit coat or a tuxedo or shorts. Leslie says everyone is dressed differently. Is there a general vibe to that scene? Shauna says there are no people in the picture, so that says something. Yep. What is the setting? Where is the picture taken? What's in the background? Are they inside, outside? Weather, I know Shauna's referenced snow. Does that impact how you approach the image? Are there any other objects in the picture? Lex says canoes. Sonia says a mail bag with some mail, Roman armor, weapons, trees, reflecting pools, signs. And these are all things that are there. They're always in the picture. We may or may not actually see them, but by going through this process, it forces us to stop and think. Okay, our third little piece. So that was our close read. We've stopped, we've paused, we've reflected. So now if you have multiple primary sources, right? And I didn't give you a lot of specifics, so these might not be closely connected at all, but that's the fun part about this, is pushing you to come up with corroborating pieces with things that aren't related. With kids, you would probably want to be pretty specific and say, here's documents or images from World War I. Here's documents or images from the March on Washington, right? You'd want to put those pieces together. But they don't have to be. So in the collection, when I do this, I bring together pieces from the Maine Historical Society and the Osher Map Library that really don't have any connections and just force you to find them. What do they have in common? It might be that there's people in them. There might be that there's not people. That they're from the 1800s. That they're all images. Lex says old cars. I don't know if we're still back in objects or in what they have in common. But again, I like where the idea, and seen people do this before, right? They'll say it's, Cindy's got one, war, right? That's a very just big, broad, general topic. And one of the sets people oftentimes come up with is death. That there's a lot of images of people, dead people from a Civil War set that I have. It's after a Battle of Gettysburg. Because you can find a lot of these image sets online. Can you do any groupings based on the similarities? So if you were to have a handful of documents, half dozen documents, images, written, maps, whatever, any sort of groupings. And this is where I'm pushing on kids to think critically, as a criticalist, and differently. There isn't a right answer. But I want them to be able to say, well, I would base them like this. So Lex says both of his can be grouped together as the celebration of the centennial. Gina's looking at the Declaration of Independence and women's suffrage. Right, so what could a kid say about the Declaration of Independence and women's suffrage? How would you group them similarity? Talking about freedom, talking about equity? Rights, I see Lex's rights. Cindy has a desire to go home. Photo of soldier from Vietnam and a letter written home from World War I. Very good. Leslie says hers are all connected through important American men and leaders. Sonia says the Spanish flu. Donna says movement west. And for me, those are things that if kids start to say things like this, you're like, okay, I think they got it. I think they've got some understanding piece. And again, I wasn't looking for a right answer, but if the only thing a kid can come up with was, well, there's words on some of them, like we may have to be looking for some stronger connections. So speaking of words, is there a word or a phrase that could describe each group? And so a lot of you did that because we're having to communicate written or verbally, right? You grouped them and then you assigned a word to that. We had war, we had Spanish flu, we had wanting to come home. We had the movement west. What else did we have back there? We had freedom, equity, celebration of the centennial. So you have them do their groupings and then title it, because right, we're back now to a title. Is there a shared perspective by at least two of the documents? So this would be kind of that evidence-based reasoning. If I'm going to start pulling things together, do at least two of the documents say the war, I'm just thinking about the war, they're wanting to go home. Do at least two of the documents say, war is bad, war is hard? Could you start to pull, again, there was that Vietnam and World War I example. Could you make the argument that soldiers suffer in war based on those pieces? Are you starting to hear those types? There was the bicentennial collection. What's the shared perspective? The Maine's bicentennial was something worth celebrating. Look at these pieces. Look what happened in 1920. People deserve equal rights. Look, according to these types of pieces. Lex says, we are proud of Maine. Craig says, the importance of individual liberties. And again, I have no idea what documents you guys have in front of you. I have no idea what you could share with kids, or if you would tell them to pick their own. There isn't a right piece, but I've got you into what, 20, I think 23, 4 questions into a primary source. And if a kid were to answer every single one of these, I'm getting a view into what they're looking at. T. Duren, Corrupt Politics in New York City, 1870. I'm interested. I want to know what his documents are, or her documents. We're going to work on corroborating them. Oopsie. What makes them all different? If we're going to look for similarities, we should also be looking for the differences, because we can look at the Declaration of Independence and we can look at the women's suffrage movement and say, yes, they're both about rights and freedoms. But if we trace that line long enough, we also know that because the Declaration of Independence and Constitution said or didn't say some things, we had to have a women's suffrage movement, right? So that same connecting thread is also the same different thread that students would have to examine, right? A great piece. Well, if all men are created equal, women's suffrage movement, is it because they said men? Where are women's rights in all of this? What does the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments that talk about African-American rights, where the formerly enslaved, what about women in that context? Would your students think about that and look at that? Can you highlight 2 of them with a conflicting perspective? So again, the same way we found those 2 pieces of evidence to support one argument, we would look for conflicting evidence that might be a rebuttal to an argument, claims and counterclaims. One student might say, well, yes, look at the Declaration of Independence said this, but aha, the women's suffrage piece said this. So maybe we have to think about it through that different lens. And again, those underlying pieces that we're working through is really claims, evidence, and reasoning, points, counterpoints, supporting evidence, digging deeper, thinking about the perspectives. Why is this person saying something? Well, what time, what year are they saying it? Where are they saying it, right? So now we're going all the way back to that sourcing information. If we're thinking about Declaration of Independence and women's suffrage, we need to know the context of 1776 and 1920. Different times, 1919, 1920. What is the author, now we're going to contextualize it, we were just talking about this. What is the author trying to tell you with this? You need to know who they are and when they are, where they are. There's a message that they are trying to get across. What is it? One of the things I talk about with photographs is art is really super easy because everything that's on a piece of art or in a political cartoon is there on purpose. Somebody consciously made the decision to do it. But photography can be the same way. You can't just say, well, it's a photograph, so it's proof. So I ask the questions, is there something that would just be on the perimeter, just off of the photograph that would completely change its meaning? And if so, did the photographer make the choice to leave it out? What's the image they're trying, or what's the message they're trying to tell you? And we'll talk more about this. I've got another session on Thursday where I'll walk you through a little more in-depth examples of how to view photography and art, et cetera, et cetera. So what is missing? Part I was just alluding to. If it's a written text, why isn't the Queen talking about people dying? If it's a photograph, why might they have left somebody off on the side? If it's a painting, why did they include a specific piece? So read that close read between the lines. What's not being said? And does it matter? Because it most likely does. If you have a group of documents, I love to have students wrestle with this. What's the most reliable one? And why? Of all these pieces of evidence, because this goes back to the sourcing component. They're having to think about the context of when it was written. They're trying to think about what it says. So if you get to make an argument with only one of those pieces, which one do you pick? Reliability is a really big issue with primary sources, having to understand who's reliable, what's reliable, why it's reliable. And the flip side to that then will be what's least reliable. Which of these would you not use? Is the year wrong? Are you worried about an author's bias? Are you worried about the audience and message they were trying to say? And again, going back to the sourcing, that's like one of the things students should know almost instinctively. We know it, we need to help them know it. If you're talking about the Civil War and you've got a document from 1861, 1862, 1864, and 1997, like that should be something they notice right away. Even if it's done by a civil, even if it's Ken Burns, that needs to be noticed right away. Well, hold on a second. These were written then. That doesn't throw out 1997, right? Maybe the person in 1862 is in the wrong place. Maybe they're in Canada and never saw the war, right? So you start to layer in all those perspectives. Give them a set of pictures or images and have them, this is my putting it all together, what would they teach with this? Is it about women's rights? Is it about voting? Is it about equity? Is this about war? Could you teach war? Because if you go back to the groupings, they group them a bunch of different ways. They may or may not be reading different things when they do the close read. I would want them to tell me what's the topic. How would I use this? And then have them basically write a DBQ, document-based question. What's the question that they would pose to somebody when they gave them these documents? So Gina's talking about her Declaration of Independence and women's suffrage. I think Lex has the Maine bicentennial, or I'm sorry, the Maine centennial piece. If you were to hand that collection over, what would you want me to think about that? Have the students do that. And again, right, we're thinking about different levels. I'm thinking about my elementary teachers in the room. That piece probably doesn't work with really young kids. When by time, you wouldn't want to layer in X number of pieces. But I'm very, very adamant that these are still the basic ideas of things for elementary kids, so that by the time they're in middle school and high school, then they do the rest of this. And they instinctively do go, oh, the year's wrong on that. That's an issue. We talked about the usefulness or the reliability of them. You could do a simple ranking. Here's my 6 documents. Here's the question. And here's the order of usefulness in answering that question. You for sure have to talk about the Declaration, number 1. You probably need to talk about the women's suffrage piece as well, number 2. And then on down. And again, all I want is for them to tell me about how they're thinking about it. Maybe they say the Declaration is the least important part, right? It's too old, it's outdated. It was written by men, women weren't involved. If we're going to talk about women's rights, we don't talk about it. And I could see it placed first, and I could see a student trying to make an argument for being placed last. I mean, depending on what the other pieces are. But either way, I just want to hear them think through that argument. So I have all that. So that's that last little piece, because I forgot to take this slide out when I separated it out. So there's your early release. I guess I've done one more. So let me exit out of that. Does anybody have any questions for me? I think everybody's got the ability to unmute, right? Yep. And while you're thinking of your questions, I will get your contact hour sheet dropped in there as well.
Is your session on Thursday building on this one, or is it overlapping with this one?
Need it paralleling?
Okay, but it's all new stuff if you were sitting on this one?
Yes. Yep,
Okay.
this is very, very explicitly, here's 28 questions to ask. The one on Thursday will be like, okay, so you've got photographs. How do you attack thinking with photographs? What are the ideas of photograph? How do you attack art? How do you look at artifacts? Where do you get inferencing versus observation type pieces? So no, these are, I would say, completely separate, even though it's all about primary sources and questioning.
Thank you.
Yep. There it is. All right, let me make sure I got this already. Other questions as I'm getting your certificate form ready for you? So again, I will have this recorded. I will post the presentation with it on the website. Any last questions for the good of the field before I turn off the recording?
I have a question. I once used a source, and I meant it to be a poor source. It was a 100 level college student giving evidence on a subject, and my 7th graders believed that she was a full-pledged authority because she was in college.
Mm-hmm.
How do you turn that around, or do you accept that? That's their level. They're 14 years old. They're not seeing things the same way as I do.
So I would just make sure I'm asking questions to digging into making sure I'm understanding why they landed at that piece. And then I would give them conflicting reports and information. Because there's some level, is the freshman college student an expert? Probably not in the most general terms or usual terms, but they also might not be wrong in how they do it. And like, it might be the level that the kids are coming to do. So if they're giving you the college freshman interpretation of the Ken Burns documentary, right? That, okay, my kids can't watch 82 days of Ken Burns' The Civil War, but they can take this. But if it's I don't want to say a wrong perspective, but if there's conflicting views, then that might be one way to say, okay, well, we've got this, we've got this, we've got this. And again, because it's not always, I think about, I had a teacher leader, one of the Stanford History Education Group pieces is they talk about sourcing, and we'll talk a little bit about this. So Lex, here's your preview for Thursday. This is one of the ones from Thursday, is what's more reliable? A book written by a historian about the signing of the Declaration of Independence written in 1998, or a Hollywood blockbuster movie about the Declaration of Independence in 2003? The most common answer probably should be, and I'll put you on the spot, Cindy, which one would you pick? What's more reliable, to follow up on your question?
A historian, as I come from a background of anthropology.
Right. And that's what Stanford would say as well. I had a teacher leader take this to her students and then call me up because she talked about some of the things she went through and talked through it. But a student said the movie. And she said, but instead of saying wrong right away, she explained, well, tell me why you're thinking, tell me more about that. And the student said, well, we know that we learn more as time goes on, right? Every year that passes, we have more information. So they took the year into account, and they said, well, the book was written by a historian. Couldn't a movie have multiple sources? And you told us it's important to be able to corroborate across multiple sources. Now, there's a lot of flaws in that logic, right? That we have no reason to believe that Hollywood would have multiple historians or would have followed, whatever. But by giving the student time to think through their thinking, the student wasn't wrong. The student was coming for a place that's like, okay. And she goes, I was super excited. Like, they had picked up on key ideas, that the timing mattered, the number of people mattered. And so that's what I would just really dig into if students were looking at that college student as the expert, they might be right, kind of the expert at that some level, but if they're not wrong, if you don't have any conflicting piece of evidence, then it's probably just okay to let it go. And I would just keep bringing in more. Okay, well, let's corroborate this. We think this person's the expert. Let's make sure we can find evidence that supports everything they've been saying. And it goes back to like the textbook isn't bad. It's just how do we use it? How do we use that piece of information? How do we use the information from the college student?
Okay, I have a question really quick. I
Yep.
just put it in the text box, but I'll ask you. Like, I want the kids to dig deep, but how do I do all of this? Like, how do I parse it out? How do I make it effective? I'm not there to walk them through this process. I like how it gets into them. Like, I've got middle school kids who will just like, blah, 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 blah. So how can I like spread it out, parse it out? And so they're getting deeper into the.
I would do, specifically set it up. If you look at the titles on the top, as you go through the SHEG stuff, I would introduce one bite of an apple at a time. I would not give them all 28. I would just do the sourcing pieces with it and then come back and talk about the sourcing and then get into the close reading. I think that was next. And then make them stop at that point and really think about what they've got before trying to, because that's what they're going to want to do. Exactly what you said, right? Especially if it's an image.
Right.
I see it, I'm good.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Joe, the link doesn't seem to be working for me. I don't know if you can resubmit it.
Was anybody else able to get in?
I pasted it into like a search engine. It worked fine.
Okay. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure I didn't copy and paste it wrong.